Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Matt, and today I want to talk about learning languages with video games. Learning languages with video games is one of the best ways to have a lot of fun, but also get a lot of exposure to the language that you're learning and get a lot out of it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started and talk about a kind of complete guide on how to do this and approach this process. So I think the first thing to really consider and to think about when you want to learn languages with video games is take an assessment of your skill level, right? Now we're going to be talking about a couple of things here, right, before even getting into the process of learning languages. So just keep that in mind. So really assessing your skill level is so important before you even begin this process. Now, you can really enjoy this process no matter what skill level you are with the language. But that being said, I do think it's probably best that if you're at least, that intermediate stage, you're going to get the most value out of the language learning process with video games than if you are a beginner or a complete beginner, right? So that intermediate stage, I think, is that nice sweet spot. Even if you're advanced, that's great too. And that's probably the best place to aim, right? Now, what does that mean, right? What is an intermediate? Well, I think it means just to have a good solid baseline of vocabulary under your belt, right? You don't need to know everything, and you're not going to know everything, but having maybe the most 1,000 common words under your belt, understanding just a good amount of vocabulary. I think the second thing is to really understand, at least at a high level, some of the basic grammar structures, right? Like, how do you talk in the present tense, in the future, or the past, right? You don't need to memorize all the endings, all the irregular rules, or whatever, depending on what language you're learning. But having kind of a nice foundation and just at least to notice that someone is talking in the future or someone is talking in the past is helpful. The more you know, the better, but just at least a high level foundation, right? You don't need to master everything, but just being able to understand that would be helpful and ideal. So, how many words do you really need to know with the vocabulary and stuff like that? It's going to just depend, right? I think just try to get a nice foundation before starting, and just give it a shot too. Now, that being said, if you are a beginner, it's not to say that you can't get gains out of this, right? It's just going to probably be more, you're going to see more gains on vocabulary acquisition, right? Learning new words that you'll see again and again, than if you were in the intermediate stage where you could get benefits out of listening comprehension and stuff like that. So don't be afraid to just say, oh, well, I want to do this, but I'm not good enough. If you're a beginner, just note that the process will probably be a little bit tougher, and you might not get as much out of it if you had maybe some more understanding of grammar or vocabulary. You can also do this as a complete beginner, no experience with the language whatsoever. I would still say that try to get some exposure with the language prior. You're just going to be super overwhelmed if you don't know what's going on at all. It's not to say that you can't learn some things and get stuff out of it, but if you're coming out of it completely fresh, no language learning experience prior to this, it might be better just to pick up the language first, get some foundation before starting. Not to say you can't do that, but it's probably a better way to approach things. All right, the next thing I wanted to talk about is this concept of where do I play the video games? And really, to be honest with you, the best place is on a PC, right? On a computer. And with computers and just PC gaming, it's just a lot easier to learn languages with video games than if you're using something like a console, right? So with PC gaming, you can use various amounts of platforms to download, see what games have what languages available, etc., on a number of platforms. So obviously the most common one probably is Steam. There's a huge library of games to play, but there's also other alternatives like the Epic Game Store, Origin, GOG, whatever, right? So that's probably to be the best place to go to learn languages, right? Not only do you have that huge category of games available to you, with varying degrees of difficulty and varying genres, but also you're going to have probably a lot more options just from a language perspective than on consoles for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into in a second. Not only that, though, it's just there's a couple of other little minor benefits as well. Really PC gaming is the best place to go, right? Now, I wouldn't be afraid of kind of doing the PC stuff, especially if you don't have a gaming PC or a really good PC. You can play a lot of older games probably pretty well on some of your computers, depending on what it is. I would definitely check those specs beforehand. But there's a lot of options available to you. on the older game front, or games that aren't graphically intensive, that you could probably run and learn from. So don't be afraid that you're not like a PC gamer and you can't do anything from that. It's still worth giving that a shot and at least trying it out and seeing what's available depending on what you have at your disposal. So obviously the other way to learn languages is through consoles, right? The current generation is the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, Xbox One. And, the biggest problem that you'll run into is just kind of this, what version of the console do you have, right? Do you have a PlayStation 4 for America, right? Or a European-based one or Japanese-based? And the reason why is because, the games that you buy on the consoles, a lot of them tend to be localized kind of in that country of origin, right? So they won't bother to include some of the languages that are available in Europe for the American version. So you only will have access to English and vice versa, right? You can get around this issue if you get a copy of like the Japanese version of a game, or like maybe a European based version of the game. If you're in Europe, it might be a little bit easier to get those different versions, but it's not the only way, right? You're just going to have a little bit more problems getting some of those translations of the games that you're playing if you are kind of using a console, right? Now, that being said, some games do offer kind of varying translations in the options menu of the game, right? Especially a lot of Japanese games will have both Japanese audio and English audio, so there is options there. Some of the games in the United States, for example, tend to have Spanish options as well, just given the proximity of Mexico and that dynamic. But it really just depends. Other genres or other studios, like maybe Ubisoft, will probably have a couple of different versions, language options in the menu, right? It just depends. But it's something to definitely look into before you buy a game or you consider just trying out a game in a certain language. You might not even have the option. So it's going to be a little bit tougher as a console gamer, but that being said, there are possibilities. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult. So now that we've talked about the ways to play the video games, I wanted to talk for a second about the genres that you can play video games with. So I think the first thing to think about is just definitely play the games that you want to play, right? There are going to be genres that are better to learn from than, others, but you want to have fun in this process, right? Because the more fun that you are having, the more engaged you are, and the more engaged, the more learning that's going to go on, the more you're going to absorb and take in. Now, if you're open to playing some of those genres that maybe are a little bit more effective, or maybe playing a game that's maybe not as entertaining for you, but you'll get more language learning gains, the better. But it's just definitely don't limit yourself to that idea, right? Because the idea behind this is we want to have fun, incorporate that hobby or, some fun aspect of things while also learning a language. So, try to focus on the fun aspect and then, go from there, right? Now, that being said, what are the best genres for learning languages with video games? Well, before we even touch that, I think it's really important to think about what are we going to be really working on and learning while we're using video games as a method of study. So the first thing is that really you're almost getting every single part of the language learning process in with video games. So the first thing is obviously reading comprehension, right? It's going to be reading the text in the story of the video game. Maybe it's reading even just the option menus or the titles of certain things. There's going to be a lot of reading comprehension going on, and as a result, a lot of vocabulary acquisition as well. So that's probably one of the first things that you can get out of video games, or pretty much any game. The second will be listening comprehension. Now, depending on the game, some games might not even have audio, but some will. You'll get a lot of listening comprehension in, and then obviously vocab acquisition as well. And along with both listening and reading, there's that idea of seeing grammar structures again and again, and that will help you to kind of reinforce understanding certain tenses in the language. Maybe it's declension ideas, whatever it is. That's also going to help as well. So you have this reading comprehension component, this listening comprehension element, and then understanding grammar as well, right? Whether that's through reading or listening. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that you actually can get a lot of speaking comprehension or speaking practice in as well, right? So if you're playing a game that's a story-based game where there is a silent protagonist, it might be beneficial just to say what the silent protagonist is saying out loud while you're playing, or to read the dialogue out loud. It's a great way to work on your accent, to just practice the speaking concept, even though there's no one prompting you to say anything, right? Now, obviously, you could play online games and practice in that foreign language. That's a more practical way to do it. But don't be afraid to just kind of speak out loud while you're playing the game, whether that's reading menus, reading the dialogue and the story, whatever, to practice your speaking comprehension as well. And then obviously there's a little bit of an aspect with writing comprehension, writing capabilities, right? If you're playing maybe like an online game, maybe there's options to type in a foreign language. It's probably one of the least likely things you'll work on, but it's still there. But really you're going to be getting a lot of reading and listening comprehension out of it, and then speaking if you can kind of force yourself to incorporate that into your learning. And then obviously with those two, you'll get better at reading and listening, but also we're picking up a lot of vocabulary and grammar along the way. Now, with that being said, what are the best genres to learn to, right? Well, in my opinion, the best are actually story-based, narrative-based games. So that's going to be your RPGs, your Japanese RPGs, or anything along those lines. And the reason why is there's just going to be a lot of reading comprehension and a lot of listening comprehension if the game has audio that's really going to just help you to learn a ton of the language. And because they tend to be narrative and story-based, you're going to want to try to pay attention, understand what's happening in the story, or just understand what's going on, right? And really absorb yourself in that world. It's almost as if you are kind of a foreigner in this land and you're trying to learn the language as you go. So the reason why RPGs and JRPGs, it's just there's a massive amount of reading and listening comprehension. The games also tend to be a little bit slower paced. And so going a little bit slower paced is probably going to help your language learning process out a lot more than a really fast paced game. And that's really one of the big advantages of playing RPGs, role-playing games, while learning a language. Now, another genre that I think is a great alternative is strategy games, grand strategy games, turn-based strategy games, something along those lines, because those games also tend to be very slow-paced, so you can take your time to really absorb the material, to learn the material. There's also probably a lot of content and a lot of things to read, to listen to, and so it's like RPGs, maybe a little bit less narrative driven, but there's a lot of kind of that slow aspect and still tons of probably reading comprehension and some listening comprehension to get out of it as well. Now, if you don't want to play any of those genres, another alternative is kind of action adventure, maybe your typical just your action adventure platform or something along those lines, where there is a narrative, but there's a lot more action to break up the game as well. So maybe not as great as an RPG, but still a good option. Now, probably some of the worst options are very fast-paced games. I would think of that as maybe like a first-person shooter or something very competitive, where it's very easy not to pay attention to the language learning process at all because of its fast-paced nature. In addition to that, though, it's just, especially if you're playing games that you know already, right, you're very familiar with, it's very easy just to know what button means what, and you know how to play the game. It's not really focused on reading comprehension or listening comprehension. You're just playing the first-person shooter or competitive game. So those aren't really the best options to learn languages. You can obviously get stuff out of it, right? You can get vocabulary when you're messing around with the menus or whatever, but it's still probably not the best option. You can still learn from them, but still, like I said, probably not the best option. So find out what works best for you. I really encourage you to just try different genres and different games out, because you're gonna have these kind of instances where the game might be really tough, or you're not having a lot of fun. Be okay with that experimentation process. So with kind of the genres and all of this other stuff established, let's talk about the actual process of learning the language while playing the video game. So I think the first thing to really stress, and I just want to keep reiterating this, is just definitely, be okay with not understanding everything. And I want to repeat that again. Be okay with not understanding everything while playing the game. This is so important, because even if you are an intermediate, advanced, higher, upper intermediate, there are going to be instances where you just do not understand everything, right? Because you're playing the game in a language kind of dedicated or built for someone that is fluent in the language. So it's totally natural to feel very overwhelmed. I think a lot of people give language learning with video games a shot, and then they get a little bit overwhelmed. Be okay with that overwhelmed feeling and really push through. I really want to stress, just be okay with being overwhelmed, because slowly over time, your language skills are going to get better, and you're going to be comfortable with this overwhelmed feeling, and you're going to just do better and get better with this process as you go along. So be okay with this being overwhelmed feeling. It's very important to stress, right? There's going to be a lot of words that you just don't know on the screen. There's going to be instances where you hear someone say something, you had no idea what they said. It sounds like a wall of sound, or a section of the game just makes no sense. Push through that, because you're going to get gains out of it. You're getting small gains here and there, whether that's learning a new word, getting better at listening comprehension, noticing a grammar structure, whatever. So be very okay with this idea. I think the second thing to talk about is take the game really slow if you can. You want to have fun, but take it very slow, right? Don't rush through things. This is why I recommend the kind of those slower paced games, because that way you can kind of really read what's going on. Try to understand what's being said to you in the role-playing game, or read the menu. What does this mean? Try to infer the meaning of the word. Try to learn what the word is and understand what's going on around you, right? It's very easy just to use visual cues or just to skip through things and not really understand what's going on. Try to avoid that. Really try to focus on that language learning process while you're playing, right? Doesn't mean you need to be obsessed with it, but just try to really take things a little bit slow and not rush through things as you go throughout this process. Very important. Don't feel overwhelmed. Once again, I want to reiterate that, but take things slow if you can, right? Really try to absorb the content, right? Read it out loud. Try to understand what's really happening and what is going on. Now, another way I think that's really great to incorporate with the language learning process is to use Google Translate. Now, with Google Translate, you can really easily incorporate this with PC gaming. If you have a second monitor, you can put that Google Translate on the second monitor and look up words that you don't know as you play the game as you go along. If you don't have a second monitor and you're playing on Steam, you can shift tab or just create a new tab and have Google Translate open that way. Or alternatively, you could have your phone, iPad, a laptop, or something else that would have Google Translate on there. And this is going to be huge, because as you play the game, you'll be able to translate things that you don't understand or you want to understand. And now that you have that meaning, right, because you looked it up, you can go enjoy the game a lot better. You understand what's being said, and your enjoyment's going to just increase a ton. Now, that being said, I would not just stress about translating every single thing, right? You don't have to understand every single phrase that's going on, or every word, or whatever, right? You don't need to translate every sentence or word, because then you're playing a Google Translate game and not the video game itself. I would definitely say, translate things that you think are relevant, maybe things that you see again and again, things that you want to know, or just periodically, so that you're just getting some understanding. You're kind of bringing away that mist from some of the words that you don't know into more of a conscious awareness, right? Now, there's going to be times where you look up a word and you're going to forget it, and you're not going to remember the word that you just looked up. Be okay with that, but it's just such an excellent tool to incorporate while you're learning languages and playing video games. So, if you can, even if you're playing a console and you have it on your phone, definitely have Google Translate up, because it's going to help with just a ton of learning as you go about the process. I think the last thing is just to have fun with this, right? You want to have fun. This is how we want to kind of approach things, is to have fun, but also learn at the same time. So, definitely enjoy yourself. Be okay with the idea that, there's going to be periods where you're distracted. You're not paying attention, or you're losing focus. Maybe in that scenario, take a break, right? Try just doing this in video games and language learning for 15 or 30 minutes. But also realize that you're going to come in and out of attention, and you're going to be concentrated on listening comprehension, be distracted or bored, and then you'll be engaged again. So be okay with this idea that you're going to go in and out. And once again, be okay with feeling overwhelmed, right? It's slowly going to get better over time. You just need to trust that process and really just stick with it. So this is what I had to say about learning languages with video games. Let me know what you think. I plan on doing some other videos around the subject probably later. Let me know if you think that's interesting. Leave a comment below, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.